Logan smirked as he rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, leaning back in the bar stool. A blind date. Come on, man, you really think I'm that desperate? His best friend, Nate, grinned and slid a beer across the counter. It's not about desperation. It's about you being a miserable workaholic who hasn't been on a real date in a year. Logan scoffed, shaking his head. I don't have time for that. That's exactly why you need this, Nate argued. Come on one dinner, if it sucks, you leave. Logan sighed, rubbing his jaw. He wasn't against dating, but he had no patience for awkward small talk, fake laughs, or the pressure of impressing someone he barely knew. But then again, his schedule had been nothing but work, gym, and sleep for months. Maybe one night wouldn't kill him. Fine, he muttered. Set it up. Nate slapped his back. You won't regret it. Logan knew better than to believe that. A week later, he stepped into a quiet little Italian restaurant, adjusting the watch on his wrist as he scanned the tables. He wasn't expecting much, probably some overly eager woman trying too hard to be charming, or worse, someone who had no interest but felt obligated to be polite. But when his eyes landed on her, everything in him stilled. She was sitting near the window, her dark hair falling over one shoulder as she nervously twisted the stem of her wine glass. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a simple black dress, but she looked effortlessly beautiful. He cleared his throat, pushing down the sudden, unexpected nerves that hit him. Madison. He asked. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his, and for a second he forgot how to speak. She smiled, hesitant but warm. You must be Logan. He slid into the chair across from her. Guilty. The waiter appeared, breaking the silence. Would you like to start with drinks? Madison glanced at her half-full glass, then looked at Logan. Wine okay? Sure, Logan said, nodding to the waiter before turning back to her. So, be honest, are you here willingly or did someone bribe you? She laughed, the sound soft but genuine. Let's just say my best friend is very persuasive. Ah, so we were both set up. Looks that way. For the first time in a long time, Logan felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Interest. The kind that made him want to know everything about the woman sitting in front of him. So, Madison, he said, leaning forward slightly. Tell me something I won't find in a boring small-talk conversation. She raised an eyebrow, a teasing glint in her eyes. Like what? Like, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever done on a date? She thought for a moment, then grinned. I once pretended I was fluent in French just to impress a guy. It backfired spectacularly when he actually spoke French and started asking me questions. Logan laughed, shaking his head. That's impressive. Did you at least make it through the night? Barely. She sipped her wine. Now you, what's your worst date story? He smirked. I once went on a date where the girl brought her ex-boyfriend. Apparently they were trying to make each other jealous. Madison winced. Ouch. Yeah, it was a fun night. He tilted his head. This is already going better than that. She smiled, and for the first time in a while, Logan felt himself relax. The conversation flowed easily after that. She was funny, sarcastic, and had a way of making him forget that he was supposed to be treating this as a joke. They talked about everything: work, embarrassing childhood stories, their love for coffee. And before he knew it, hours had passed. I can't believe how late it is, Madison said, glancing at her watch. Logan checked his own and frowned. Wow, that went by fast. She hesitated, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I had a really nice time. He didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was the way she looked at him with those warm, inviting eyes, or the way her laughter had settled into his chest like something familiar, but he reached across the table, lightly brushing his fingers over hers. Me too, he admitted. For a moment she didn't pull away, and neither did he. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. He sighed, knowing it was probably work. I should, yeah, she said softly, pulling her hand back. Of course. They stood outside the restaurant, the air crisp but not uncomfortably cold. Logan shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly not wanting the night to end. Can I walk you to your car? He asked. Madison smiled. That would be nice. They walked in comfortable silence, and when they reached her car, she turned to him, hesitating. So, was this as terrible as you thought it would be? He let out a small laugh. Not even close. Something flickered in her expression, relief, maybe. Good, she said, biting her lip. Before he could overthink it, Logan reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Would it be crazy if I said I want to do this again? Her breath hitched just slightly. Not crazy at all. And just like that, a blind date that was supposed to be a joke turned into something else entirely. Something real. Logan wasn't the kind of guy who checked his phone every 5 minutes, but the next day, he found himself glancing at it more times than he cared to admit. Madison had been different. The kind of different that settled into his thoughts and refused to leave. By midday, he gave in and texted her. Logan, so, is it too soon to say last night was the best blind date I've ever been on? Her response came almost immediately. Madison, that depends. How many blind dates have you been on? He smirked, leaning back in his chair. Logan, do we count the one where my date brought her ex? Madison, definitely not. Logan, then last night was the only one, but still the best. He could almost hear her laugh through the text, and damn if that didn't make him want to see her again. Logan, what are you doing tonight? A pause. Then, Madison, are you asking me on a second date? Logan, I'm asking if you want to eat food with me again and possibly laugh at my bad jokes. Madison, tempting offer. But I have a shift at the bookstore until 8. Bookstore, that explained a lot. She had the kind of presence that felt like a well-loved novel, something you wanted to keep coming back to, just to experience it all over again. Logan, then I guess I'll have to wait until another night. Madison, or you could stop by if you're not too busy. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A second date wasn't supposed to happen this fast. He was supposed to play it cool, not rearrange his evening just to see her again. But he already knew the answer before he even typed it. Logan, what time should I be there? The little bookstore was tucked between a coffee shop and a florist, the kind of place that smelled like old pages and fresh ink. Logan pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell announcing his arrival. Madison stood behind the counter, stacking a pile of books, and when she looked up, something in her expression shifted surprise, then warmth. You actually came, she said, setting the books down. You invited me, he pointed out, stepping closer. True, she admitted. Still, I half expected you to bail, he leaned against the counter. Not my style. The store was quiet, a few customers browsing the shelves. Madison seemed at ease here, moving between the aisles with practiced familiarity. So, this is your world? He asked, watching as she straightened a row of novels. She smiled. One of them, I work here part-time. And the other part, she hesitated, then shrugged, I'm a freelance editor. I help people polish their manuscripts before they send them to publishers. He raised an eyebrow. So you're one of the first people to read books before the rest of the world sees them. Pretty much. That's kind of amazing, she laughed. Not always. Some of them are, let's just say, not great. Logan smirked. You ever read something so bad you wanted to set it on fire? Once or twice. He liked this easy back and forth, the way she spoke without pretense. A customer approached, and Madison turned her attention to them, ringing up their purchase. Logan wandered the store, running his fingers along the spines of books, letting the quiet settle around him. When she was free again, she found him near the poetry section. Didn't peg you as a poetry guy, she mused. I'm not, he admitted. But I figured I'd pretend for a few minutes to impress you. She tilted her head, amused. And is it working? He plucked a book from the shelf, flipping it open at random. Let's see. Clearing his throat, he read, I loved you before I knew you before I met you, and still I love. He stopped, realizing what he was saying, and glanced up at her. Madison's lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. Wow, she murmured. You really committed to that. He shut the book with a smirk. I have my moments. She shook her head, but there was something softer in her gaze now. Before he could overthink it, he asked, Want to grab something to eat after your shift? She hesitated just long enough for him to wonder if he'd pushed too soon. But then she smiled. Yeah, she said, I'd like that. An hour later, they sat across from each other in a small diner, the neon sign outside casting a soft glow through the window. Madison stirred her milkshake with her straw, watching him. So what do you actually do, Logan, other than go on life-changing blind dates? He chuckled. I'm in marketing. Mostly branding for small businesses. Do you like it? He thought for a second. Yeah, it's challenging, but it keeps me on my toes. She nodded. I can see that about you. He raised an eyebrow. See what? You like a challenge. Logan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. And what about you? You like a challenge. Madison mirrored his posture, her voice quieter now. Depends on the challenge. The air between them shifted, something unspoken lingering in the space that neither of them seemed ready to name just yet. But it was there, undeniable. And Logan knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't just another date. It was something more, something that could change everything. Logan wasn't used to this constant pull toward someone, the way his thoughts kept drifting to Madison at the most random moments. He'd be in the middle of a meeting, nodding along to some client's marketing strategy, and suddenly, he'd remember the way she laughed when he butchered that poetry reading. It had been 3 days since their impromptu second date, and they'd texted every day. Nothing overly serious, just small conversations that somehow lasted for hours. He knew she liked her coffee with too much sugar, that she had a habit of buying books faster than she could read them, that she had a scar on her knee from falling off a bike as a kid and never quite mastered riding one again. And yet, despite all the talking, he still wanted more. So when Friday night rolled around, he found himself standing outside her apartment, a pizza box in one hand and a 6-pack of soda in the other. When she opened the door, barefoot and wearing an oversized sweater, her surprise melted into something warmer. Logan, she glanced at the food in his hands, then back at him. Did I forget we made plans? He smirked. Nope. I just figured it's Friday night, and if you didn't have plans, I'd bribe my way in with food. She leaned against the doorframe, pretending to consider. What kind of pizza? Pepperoni and extra cheese. She stepped aside, motioning him in. You may enter. Her apartment was small but cozy, bookshelves overflowing, a soft throw blanket draped over the couch. It smelled faintly of vanilla and something floral, a scent that felt inherently her. He set the pizza on the coffee table, watching as she tucked her legs beneath her on the couch. So is this a thing now? She asked, grabbing a slice. What? You showing up unannounced with food? He grinned. Depends. You gonna kick me out? She took a bite, chewing slowly before answering. Nah, I think I like it. Something about the way she said it settled deep in his chest. They ate, flipping through channels until they settled on some old comedy. The conversation was easy, flowing between teasing remarks and comfortable silences. And then, somewhere between the second slice of pizza and the third episode of the show, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It wasn't a big gesture, nothing dramatic. But Logan felt it everywhere. He hesitated, then without thinking too much about it tilted his head slightly, just enough for his cheek to brush against her hair. She smelled like coconut and something sweet, and he had to fight the urge to close his eyes and just breathe her in. Madison didn't move away. If anything, she sighed softly. Like this, whatever this was felt just as natural to her as it did to him. They stayed like that for a long time, the show playing in the background, neither of them saying anything. And for the first time in a long time, Logan felt something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. Peace. But peace never lasted long. His phone buzzed on the table, and when he saw the name flashing on the screen, his stomach tightened. Madison must have felt him tense because she lifted her head, glancing at the phone. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. He exhaled through his nose, raking a hand through his hair. I should take this. It's my boss. She nodded, scooting back to give him space as he stood. The call was short, but enough to ruin the moment. When he returned, Madison was sitting cross-legged, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the couch cushion. "Everything okay?" she asked. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Just work stuff. They want me to go out of town next week for a few days." Something flickered across her face, but she covered it quickly. "That's not too bad." "No, it's not." He hesitated. "But I don't really want to go." Her lips parted slightly, surprised. "Why not?" He held her gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to understand. And when she did, she looked away, a small smile playing at her lips. She knew, and that scared him more than anything. Because this whatever was happening between them, it wasn't a joke anymore. It wasn't some casual fling or a way to pass the time. It was real, and real was dangerous. Real meant risk. Risk of wanting something he might not be able to have. Risk of falling for someone who could walk away. But looking at her now, the way her fingers curled around the edge of her sweater, the way she stole glances at him like she was trying to figure him out, he realized something else. Some risks were worth taking. So instead of overthinking it, instead of letting himself get caught up in all the ways this could go wrong, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. And when she squeezed back, just slightly, he knew. This was already bigger than either of them had planned, and there was no turning back now. Logan stood outside Madison's apartment, his breath coming out in short, frustrated bursts. He'd barely slept since their last night together, since that quiet moment on the couch when he'd held her hand, and everything had shifted between them. Now, just days later, he was leaving for his work trip, and the thought of being away from her for even a few days sat uneasily in his chest. He knocked, and when she opened the door, barefoot and wrapped in a thin cardigan, his stomach clenched. "You're early," she said, hugging her arms around herself. "Yeah," he admitted. "Didn't want to leave without seeing you." Something flickered in her expression, something soft, something careful. "Come in." He stepped inside, the familiar scent of her apartment wrapping around him. She leaned against the counter, watching him. "You're acting like you're going away forever." He let out a breath. "I know, it's stupid." She tilted her head. "It's not stupid, just unexpected." Logan ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, you're unexpected, Madison." Her lips parted slightly, something unreadable passing over her face. His chest tightened. He wasn't sure what this was between them, wasn't sure how deep he'd fallen already, but it was enough to make walking away, even temporarily, feel wrong. She took a step closer, her voice quieter now. "It's just a few days, Logan," he nodded, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'll be here when you get back," she added, like she could sense the war happening inside him. A shaky exhale left his lips, and before he could second-guess himself, he cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "If I kiss you now, I'm not going to want to leave," he murmured. Her breath hitched, her fingers curling into the front of his jacket. "Then don't." The words barely had time to settle before his mouth was on hers. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't patient. It was weeks of tension, of holding back, of pretending this wasn't happening. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as he backed her against the counter, his fingers gripping her waist like she might disappear the second he let go. Madison sighed against his lips, and the sound sent a shiver down his spine. But then, too soon, she pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "You need to go," she whispered. He groaned. "I really, really don't want to," she smiled, pressing a quick kiss to his jaw. "Go, knock him dead at your fancy work thing, and then come back to me." His fingers flexed against her hips. "That's dangerous wording, Madison," she arched a brow. "Why?" "Because now I'm going to be thinking about you the whole damn time," she grinned. "Good." With a reluctant sigh, he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I'll call you when I land." Her eyes softened. "I'd like that." And with one last look, one last second of hesitation, he forced himself to walk out the door. The days passed slower than they should have. Logan spent most of his time in conference rooms, nodding along to presentations while his phone burned a hole in his pocket. They texted constantly. Small things. Madison, you'd hate the guy who came into the bookstore today. He spent 10 minutes explaining why e-books are superior to physical copies. Logan, I already hate him. Madison, I knew you would. Logan, how's your night? Madison, boring, just watching some old movie. Logan, wish I was there. Madison, me too. It was ridiculous how much he missed her. By the time his flight home rolled around, he was practically vibrating with impatience. The second he landed, he pulled out his phone. Logan, back in town. Are you home? Her response was instant. Madison, I was just about to text you. Can you come over? His stomach flipped. Logan, on my way. The second she opened the door, he knew something was wrong. Her usual warmth was still there, but beneath it, something was off. Madison, he asked, stepping inside. She let out a shaky breath, closing the door behind him. I wasn't sure how to tell you this. His pulse kicked up. Tell me what? She hesitated, then reached for a small envelope on the counter, handing it to him. He frowned, opening it. His stomach dropped. Inside was a letter, a job offer out of state. His throat tightened. You applied for this, she shook her head. No, they reached out to me, a publishing house. They saw some of my freelance work and they want me on their team. He exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a job, this was her dream. His chest ached. When would you leave? She chewed her lip. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That wasn't enough time. Not enough time to figure out what this was between them. Not enough time to make it make sense. He swallowed hard. Do you want to go? She hesitated, and that hesitation shattered something inside him. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. The silence between them was thick, heavy. He wanted to tell her to stay. Wanted to be selfish, to say that what they had, whatever this was worth more than any job offer. But he couldn't. Because Madison wasn't the kind of woman you held back. She was the kind you let fly, even if it killed you. His jaw clenched. You should take it. Her eyes snapped to his, wide and unsure. Logan, you deserve this. His voice was rough, and I won't be the reason you walk away from it. She let out a shaky breath. But what about us? His throat tightened. He didn't know. He had no idea how to make this work, how to fix the ache already settling deep in his chest. But he had to try. So instead of answering, he reached for her, his fingers threading through hers. We'll figure it out, he murmured, if you want to. Her grip tightened. I want to. And just like that, he knew no matter how complicated this got, no matter how much it hurt, letting her go wasn't an option. Because somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, he'd already fallen. Logan wasn't sure how to do this. The days that followed Madison's announcement felt like walking on unstable ground, as though every step might send them tumbling into something neither of them was ready for. She had 2 weeks. 2 weeks before she left for a job that could change her life. 2 weeks before she wasn't just a short drive away. Before he couldn't just show up at her door with pizza and a bad excuse to see her. And despite the ache in his chest, he refused to be anything but supportive. So he helped her pack. He sat on her couch, sorting through books, laughing as she tried to convince him that, yes, she really did need to take all of them. He listened as she rambled about the job, about how exciting and terrifying it was all at once. And when she stumbled over her words, fingers twisting together like she was bracing for him to be upset, he kissed her. Every time, because he wasn't upset. He was just in love with a woman who was leaving, and he had no idea how to tell her that. One night, a week before she was supposed to go, they found themselves lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling in silence. Her head rested against his chest, the steady rise and fall of her breath grounding him in a way he desperately needed. His arm was wrapped around her, fingers tracing absent patterns against her shoulder. She exhaled, voice soft. You're quiet. I'm thinking. About, he hesitated, then murmured, how much this is going to suck. Her fingers curled against his shirt. Yeah, the room felt too still, too heavy. Like they were both waiting for something neither of them knew how to say. Finally, she whispered, I don't want to lose this. His grip tightened around her. "You're not losing me, Madison." She tilted her head, looking up at him. "Logan, I mean it." He shifted, turning so they were facing each other. "I don't know how we're going to make this work, but I know I want to try. Unless you don't, I do." The words came out fast, desperate, like she'd been waiting for him to ask. Relief crashed over him. "Okay," he breathed. "Then we figure it out." Her eyes searched his, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Long-distance relationships don't always work. Neither do blind dates," he countered, and look how that turned out. A shaky laugh left her lips. "Logan, I love you." The words fell out before he could stop them, unplanned and raw. Madison sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes widening. He hadn't meant to say it like that. Hadn't meant to say it at all, not yet. But now that it was out there, he couldn't take it back, didn't want to, because it was the truth. He was in love with her. With the way she bit her lip when she was thinking. With the way she could make him laugh even when he didn't want to. With the way she fit against him like she'd always belonged there. She stared at him, unblinking, and then, just when doubt started creeping in, she whispered, "Say it again." His throat tightened. "I love you." A slow smile spread across her face, something shining in her eyes, and then she kissed him. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like she was memorizing the shape of his mouth against hers. But then her hands slid into his hair, pulling him closer, and suddenly, nothing else existed. She pulled back just enough to murmur, "I love you too." And just like that, everything shifted. This wasn't just something temporary, this was real. And no amount of distance was going to change that. The airport was too loud, too bright, too crowded, too final. Logan stood near the departure gate, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Madison check her ticket for the third time, her fingers fidgeting with the edges like she wasn't sure if she should hold onto it or rip it in half. She looked up at him. "You're sure about this?" His chest ached. "No," he admitted. "But I'm sure about you." Her lips parted slightly, and for a second she just stared at him like she was trying to memorize his face, like she was afraid she might forget the way he looked at her. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're going to do amazing things, Madison." She swallowed hard, her eyes shining. "I hate this." "Me too," he murmured. The overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing final boarding for her flight. Her breath hitched. "Logan, go," he said softly, forcing a small smile. "Before I do something stupid like ask you to stay." She let out a weak laugh, but then she surged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding onto him like she never wanted to let go. His hands gripped her waist, his fingers pressing into the fabric of her sweater as he buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'll call you the second I land," she whispered against his skin. He nodded, throat too tight to speak. She pulled back just enough to press a kiss to his lips, soft, lingering, filled with everything they didn't have time to say. And then she was gone. Logan stood there, watching as she disappeared through security, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't move until she was completely out of sight. And when he finally turned to leave, he realized something. He'd never missed someone this much before they were even gone. The days blurred together. They talked every night, their voices filling the silence of their separate spaces. Madison told him about her new apartment, about the city, about the way everything felt too big and too new. And Logan listened, because that's all he could do. But it wasn't enough. Not when he fell asleep reaching for her and woke up to cold sheets. Not when he caught himself looking at his phone every 5 minutes, waiting for a message, a call, something to make the distance feel less unbearable. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the half-eaten takeout on his coffee table, he realized something else. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be with her. Before he could overthink it, he grabbed his phone. "Logan, what if I came to visit?" Her response was instant. "Madison, when?" "Logan, tomorrow." A pause. Then, "Madison, are you serious?" "Logan, dead serious." "Madison." "Logan, that's crazy." "Logan, yeah, but I love you." Another pause longer this time. Then Madison booked the flight. Madison was pacing when he stepped out of the terminal. She hadn't seen him yet, but he could see her biting her lip, shifting from foot to foot. Her phone clutched in her hand like she was ready to call him if he took even a second longer. And then she looked up, their eyes met, and suddenly the world righted itself. She ran. Logan dropped his bag just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms, her legs wrapping around his waist, her breath warm against his neck as she clung to him like she never wanted to let go. He held her tighter. "Tell me this isn't crazy," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to look at her, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "It's the best decision I've ever made," he murmured, her lips parted, her eyes searching his. And then she kissed him. It wasn't soft this time, it was desperate, it was relief. It was everything they had been holding back for too long. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, a breathless laugh escaping her lips. "You're really here," she whispered. He smirked. "Get used to it." She arched a brow. "Oh," he exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. "I don't want to do this without you," he admitted. "I don't want to wake up in a different city, counting down the days until I can see you again. I don't want to just visit." He swallowed hard. "I want to be with you, Madison." "Every day," her breath hitched. "You're saying, I'm saying I'll figure it out, work, moving, all of it. I don't care how long it takes. I just know I don't want to be anywhere you're not." Tears welled in her eyes, but she was smiling, a wide, breathtaking smile. "Logan," she whispered, shaking her head like she couldn't believe this was real. He cupped her face, brushing his lips against hers. "I love you," he murmured. "And I'm not letting you go." She let out a shaky breath. "Good," she whispered. "Because I wasn't going to let you go either." And as he kissed her again, as the world faded around them, he knew, this was it. This was home, her, always.